Welcome to episode 16. You are trapped in history with me, your host, Robbie Malcolmson. I have been a high school history teacher for 15 years. And as of today, as I told my guest, I started my 16th year in high school. And it was a great day. It was a really good start. As usual, this podcast is meant to support history teachers and students, as well as anyone that is purely interested in history. I am particularly excited about this episode. I've wanted to do something like this for a while. This guest, I've followed him for 3 or 4 years now on his YouTube channel, and I've been able to buy a couple of the books. And I'm just really looking forward to picking his brain because I'm a teacher that will often use like video clips and sometimes movies in class. And I know there can be some negative stigmas and sometimes justifiably about how movies or film is used in class, whether it is abused or not. I'm really looking forward to kind of picking his brain. So this episode tonight is entitled A Conversation with Professor, Author, and YouTuber Jared Frederick. So Jared, I really appreciate you making it on. I know you have an extremely busy schedule and I respect that, but I appreciate you making it.
Thank you for having me.
And again, like I said, you're used to doing this all the time, and you're so used to being the host. I don't know how often you've been on as guest of ones, but like I said, I appreciate it. I think for any of our guests that might listen to it that somehow have not read one of your books or watched the YouTube channel before, I had a few follow-up questions or some intro questions here for any guest at the beginning, and then we'll jump into our third segment, the main topic of the movies. So Jared, just kind of lump some of these together. Can you just give our guest an idea of maybe where you're from, where you attended college, and what you do professionally in a more specific way that I had introduced you?
I hail from Altoona, Pennsylvania. I grew up in that area, and from the outset, I always had an appreciation for vintage things and bygone time periods. I can remember when I was in kindergarten, the United States commemorated the 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus. So people can do the math and figure out roughly how old I am from that. And so, that was kind of interesting for me as a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old or however old I was at the time. But, it was the first time that I can remember, oh, like people are commemorating something that took place a long time ago. Whether it can and should be commemorated the way it was is a whole other argument. But in any case, that was the first time that I remember a historical observation as such, and it really grew from there. My appetite for history was further whetted by a number of historical movies and TV shows that I was introduced to throughout my childhood. And by the time I was 11, I knew that I wanted to be a historian for my vocation. And so I enrolled in a history program at Penn State Altoona, where I, in fact, teach history now. I teach several of the courses that I myself enrolled in close to 20 years ago now. And I went on and received my master's degree in U.S. history from West Virginia University. I taught for a number of years. And in more recent years, I have been working on my doctorate in American Studies, which I obtained this past February. And so for over half a year now, I have been Dr. Frederick.
Oh, wow. Well, congratulations, Dr. Frederick. I should have introduced you as such on that too. So
That's quite all right.
Definitely congratulations.
I'm not pretentious about it.
It's all right. Yeah, I'd say I definitely met some that are like that. I think it's fascinating that you can remember that. I don't know if I can remember a whole lot from when I was 5 or 6, but I think it's fascinating that was one of your first memories where you realized that, hey, this is something of value. This is something that people are paying attention to. And I appreciate as a teacher as well that you brought up whether or not that should be. It's a whole nother question. I do have a follow-up question here for you, because I know you said you were able to teach some of the classes that you had taken previously. When it comes to your pedagogy compared to what maybe you were taught before, did it seem like a pretty strong discrepancy? Like, was it quite different in the style that you taught it compared to the way you were taught those particular subjects?
That's a great question. And I like to think that I took the best elements of many of my professors and I infused it into my own style. What makes a good teacher? Well, at the heart of it is storytelling. And so I try to be a good storyteller, but what I attempt to do to enrich storytelling is to be a visual storyteller. And even though PowerPoint is the drudgery of many in office meetings, when it's done right, it can be a very valuable tool for keeping young people engaged who are frankly addicted to looking at
Mhm.
screens. And if you want to compete with the phone that is in their pocket or the tablet that is in their backpack, you better be prepared to up your game and offer a little bit of competition in order to keep their attention.
That is awesome advice because any teacher that listens to this, I think that's exactly what many of us, definitely me included, need to hear. I do tend to be a visual teacher, and I'll use in our school system we rely heavily on Google Slides, which, as you know, is pretty much the same as that. But you're right. In any professional development trainings we're in, when that PowerPoint comes up on the screen, we're all kind of like, oh man, another PowerPoint. But you have a good point about it's just the way that you use it and the way that you storytell. I do feel like, I don't know if you would agree on this or not, because I don't want to bring up this word as though to diminish what you're doing. Do you think any part of teaching would be I'm sorry, do you think any part of a teacher's requirements should also be entertainment? Because obviously we want to challenge our learners and be rigorous and whatnot, but I've always felt like there's a certain responsibility that we have to be also kind of entertaining. Or do you
Mhm.
feel like that's a little bit too romanticized way of looking at it?
I think it completely depends upon the subject matter.
Hmm.
If you're teaching the Holocaust, perhaps making it
Oh,
entertaining is not
yes.
the
Yeah,
way to
yeah,
go.
yeah.
If you're talking about the history of jazz or baseball or old Hollywood, or the rise of rock and roll in the 1950s or the British invasion, yeah,
Mhm.
like you can
Oh, yeah.
definitely make it entertaining. I think it's solely left to the discretion of educators to what level of entertainment. Now, I
Mhm.
don't think we should confuse entertainment with engagement because you can tackle serious subject matter and make it engaging, not in a fun or frivolous sort of way, but
Yeah.
in a way that personalizes the past and can make it all the more accessible to young people. So if you can't make it entertaining, you should make it engaging.
Yeah, I think you make a great point again there. I think that maybe that's the better academic vocabulary to focus on instead of focusing on entertainment. I should look at it as more engaging because that way it doesn't necessarily matter the tone. And I know in AP classes, those one of those skills that we focus on when we're working with students for documents. Tone is one of those historical skills that we'll focus on sometimes of what tone this particular document has. So I do appreciate your outlook on that. I had another personal question for you when it comes to teaching. I know this is going to be obviously a little heavier on the teaching part of the podcast than the YouTube, but I think all of us somewhere along the line had an individual, maybe whether it was in your high school years or younger, or maybe in your college, undergrad, or even in your master's program. Was there any particular person uh, that really inspired you towards the teaching part? Because I know you wanted to be a historian, but what eventually pulled you into enjoying the teaching aspect of it? I didn't know if you had anybody along the line that you usually like. I don't know. You wouldn't say mimicked, but inspired you from that.
Yeah, I had two professors as an undergraduate student who really imparted to me some valuable lessons, both of whom are colleagues of mine now at Penn State Altoona. And one of them was a very evocative storyteller. And he didn't show any pictures on a PowerPoint screen, he didn't pass anything around. He connected the dots on a chalkboard. Yet somehow he was still able to keep people's attention because his passion, his vigor, his knowledge was so readily apparent that he had this sort of magnetism to him, and he still does. And he cares very much about that. His name is Dr. Steve Andrews. Uh, Another one of his colleagues, Dr. Brian Black, uh, has a very skilled and multifaceted level of being able to make history interdisciplinary. He was able to bring in ideas of environmentalism and consumerism and popular culture and film, and how all of these things were reflective of different eras of the past. And he was also very friendly toward the idea of public history and historians going out into their communities and becoming involved with putting up historical markers or historical societies. And so those two individuals at my undergraduate level played a profound impact on my outlook as an educator. And then there were people who I worked with in the National Park Service when I was a park ranger at Gettysburg National Military Park. People like D. Scott Hartwig, who is a very well-known Civil War scholar. One of his good friends and comrades in green and gray uniform, John Heiser, both of whom I'm very close with still. And so whether it be in the classroom or outside of the classroom, it all goes back to that idea of engagement and how you interact with
Mhm.
people.
Well, I appreciate that, and something that I've noticed in just the few years that I've watched your YouTube channel, that I noticed that as busy as you are, you still seem like you get to travel a fair amount. Like you still get, I've seen you be able to go over the Normandy and other places in Europe, even on a smaller scale. Just recently, whenever you were coming to Kentucky for a guest speaking thing, I could be wrong, but I thought you stopped in West Virginia. Didn't you stop at a cemetery and you paid like honor to a band of brothers, a soldier that had been there? So for me, like whenever you brought that up earlier about the professor that really encouraged being more like publicly involved, I feel like you definitely take that to heart. I feel like you try to get yourself out of your comfort zone. I have to admit, I need to do a better job of that. In my first 15 years of teaching, that's one of my regrets. Is I would like to. I need to start becoming more involved, like locally, even or on
Mm.
even on a state level. And but so I appreciate your outlook on that. That leads me to another question for you, and I'm going to ask another TikToker about this pretty soon that teaches AP as well. Is I wonder about traveling, because I haven't had the chance to travel very much, and not out of the United States. I've seen several places here, and I know you really like covering the Civil War history, but I've noticed that you've gone a fair amount overseas, over in Europe. As far as teaching goes, what advice do you have for teachers that may consider traveling? So if you're a history teacher and you've considered traveling more, are there certain benefits do you think that we could gain from traveling and visiting these historical places and probably becoming as immersed as we can in these? Well, what value do you think that we could draw from that?
Absolutely. And I think there's two ways to answer your question. One is if an educator merely travels on their own and absorbs what they see, or are they brave and daring enough to take students with them in overseas travels, which some have the
Mhm.
tenacity and the merit to do so. And my hat's off to
Oh
individuals
yeah.
like that, because there's a lot of planning and logistics and clearances that go into something as such. But I'll answer the first one to start us off. And this was a tactic that I learned from my own father, who taught earth science for more than a decade, into the early years after I was born. And even though he and I taught very different subjects, he was able to impart something to me that I think was very valuable. And that was the idea of conveying stories of the past and stories of place through your own personal experiences. Case in point, in 1979, he, as a young man right out of college, rode his bicycle across the United States, and it took him 3 weeks.
Wow.
And he was a geographer by academic training, and he took pictures of landforms and different landmarks across the way. And sometimes he would put himself in the photos, have somebody else take the picture. And so he was able to transform those into slides that back in the day you had to put in a carousel in
I
order to
remember
show
those.
students. And I still run into his students 40 years onward who tell me that they remember his slides from his
Wow.
cross-country bicycle trip. And they were able to memorize different kind of landforms and geological
Mhm.
features because he told the story of it through a personal lens. And I think whether you are a geographer, an art teacher who might go to an art museum, the history teacher who goes to historic sites, showing your students a picture of a place that you have been to and incorporating yourself into that photo, it really is able to capture their attention because, like, wow, like this person, they've traveled, they've seen things, they've experienced things. So I think that is a very helpful approach
Mhm.
in pulling students into a story.
Well, I appreciate that. I know that in our area, our demographics, we're in a rural area. We have a relatively good sized school, almost 1,100 students, but our area is mostly conservative, mostly not very racially diverse. And there's definitely plenty of students that haven't really left the state of Kentucky or just barely on that. And you just reminded me, my previous team teacher had taught world history with me, Megan Basham, and my current one. Both of them are former students of mine, which makes me feel old. But the cool thing is, both of them were able to travel to Europe and won multiple times. And they did exactly what you said. Like, they both have images of examples of going to Auschwitz and taking pictures
Mm,
themselves and having pictures there, different like palaces in France and other places. And they get to show their students that in the Google slides that we use.
yeah.
And what you said makes me like, that's one of those times where I feel guilty for not having traveled more when I was younger, like in my
Mm,
20s, because I felt like, man, I really should have taken advantage of that more when I was in college, because that does enhance your teaching more. It adds so much more to it. So, like, consider the demographic. I don't know what your father's demographic mainly was whenever he was teaching in that location, but I know if he was showing what he did to my students, it would mind blow them. Because no, for one thing, like as an adult, I'm amazed at what your father did on a bicycle across the country. That's amazing in itself. But imagine from a teenager perspective, like, their world as we know is a much more minimized than ours, and that would just expand their scope on that. And I don't see how anybody could forget that. So it doesn't really surprise me that after all those years, he had students, former students, that still remember that. And it makes me want to be a lot more ambitious on these last 15 or 16 years that I have until I get to 30. I really want to take advantage for that. And as you know, you're well aware of, sometimes I forget that, I really love covering the Civil War. I'm a world history teacher. I teach AP European history, but I've always grown up on like the Civil War. And I always forget how many battlefields there are really close to me, like
right.
Nashville. And I'm only like an hour from there. And you got Shiloh really close by. So it's one of those things where, as a teacher, I need to yield your advice, and or heed it and try to expand myself a lot more. And you brought up another thing earlier, is as daunting as it is, considering taking students to that. Like, I think as high school teachers, we get really nervous about that with liability and things like that. But I admire teachers that do that. That's really amazing. Now, this is a strange question for you. I'm going to shift gears a little bit here. That I asked my previous teacher this, and I don't know if you really have any go-to ones on that. But my podcast is predicated mainly for history teachers, one way or another. But as a teacher, I usually have 5 or 10 sources or documents that I'll use every year when I'm teaching. And I don't know why, but they're like my go-to ones. I do a lot of good ones, but for some reason when I get to those, I'm like extra excited. They have really good biases or point of views or contextualization. It's just really good to do it. I was just kind of curious for you, because whether it be visual, clips or written documents, is there any documents, like what would be one of the most effective sources or documents, or just sources in general, that you've used before, or that maybe even you continue to still use?
There's one that immediately comes to mind, and that is a radio broadcast that I have students listen to. We usually think of primary sources almost exclusively as a written document that we must read. But of course, it's much broader than that. And there's one that comes to mind, and that is a 1940 broadcast by CBS News reporter Edward Murrow, who is reporting from London during the Blitz. And students are able to put themselves in his shoes, even though they cannot see what he was seeing. And they can also get a sense of how broadcast journalism has changed, because if you were a radio man reporting from a rooftop in a city that's being bombed, you have to be much more descriptive than what somebody on cable news would be today in a similar situation. And so the importance of language and poise and comportment and how one presents oneself is very evident in primary sources like that. And beyond the face value of hearing the sound of the bombs and the planes and vehicles in the background, you can also consider, well, how does something like this play into propaganda purposes during World War II?
Exactly.
Is this merely objective journalism, or is it meant to pluck at the heartstrings of Americans who are kind of isolationist and on the fence about getting involved in things like this? And how do reports like this help sway Americans in one direction or another? So I think that is a very handy example.
Mhm.
And I encourage teachers not only to use written documents in newspapers and all the traditional stuff like diaries, but also paintings, newsreels, radio broadcasts, maps, and even artifacts if you have the opportunity.
Well, that's great. It's a phenomenal advice. And I might have to email you later and ask you for the source of that radio broadcast. I would love to use that. And so, obviously, my AP Euro class, I would love to use that one day when I'm teaching World War II. I think it's great about what you brought up. That it sounds to me as a teacher, you're always trying to get your students to look beyond the surface level, like between the lines of things, because it's easier to focus on the bombs and those kind of sound effects, but listen to the language he's doing. I love how you brought up the propaganda importance. How could this be viewed from multiple points of view? Now, I'm also curious when teachers share really interesting aspects like you did. I'm also curious of student reactions. Like, do you recall in general, like in a general level, whenever you're breaking this down to students and they're answering these things to you, what sort of reactions are you usually seeing from your students?
In regard to that particular source, students are frankly surprised by how caught up in the story they become. And a lot of them are slightly unnerved by it because they weren't expecting to be so chilled or intimidated, perhaps is a good word, for what they are hearing, because they have to use their imaginations and they have to put themselves in the place of this reporter. And I tell them to take it a step further, and I tell them, I want you to picture you and your entire family sitting in a living room, in your living room. And instead of all of you sitting around and watching the television, I want you to replace that television with one of these. And I showed them a picture of a big console radio from the 1930s. If you were listening to this in real time, what would you be thinking? What would you be feeling?
Mm.
What sort of action would it inspire you to do? And so, once again, by placing things in the personal, by telling them to think of themselves sitting in their living room, listening to this, it opens up the door for all sorts of opportunities for
Mhm.
conversation.
And that's some of the continuity and themes that I brought that I've kind of caught from your advice tonight, from the beginning of our conversation to now. That it seems like it's not just the narrative storytelling and making that meaningful and exciting, but like you said, like making it more immersive, making it engaging to them. And it seems like the I don't know. I think that you're very good at taking ideas and like unraveling them. Like just from watching your YouTube channel, I've been able to like appreciate, like for example, I'm a big fan of Band of Brothers and Gettysburg and those series, but I feel like it's kind of like peeling an onion back. I feel like you've been able to show me layers that I never would have found on my own, and it inspired me to go look in other places. I also do. You inspired me to do something else in class that I even had the access to do, and I spent all these years not doing it. I have all these books in my library that I've done that cover topics that I cover. I never recommend that to students. I don't know why I've never done that. So now when I'm doing material in class, I'm like, hey, you can also read more about this in this book. Like,
Mhm.
so I'm trying to get curious minds to like keep following that rabbit hole, like keep going on down there. So I appreciate your feedback on those questions, and encouraging, trying to be as immersive as you can, because for our students, like you brought up earlier, they're on an addictive level to the screens in their hands. So how do you make that story real to them? Like, how do you make that immersive? Where can you imagine being in your living room? I have students that I don't think they share a living room with their family. I think families go to their separate rooms and just watch their phones a lot of times, or they eat
Mhm.
separately. So it's a challenge. I've noticed that in just the 15 years I've taught, that it's evolved a little bit. And like you said earlier, we kind of have to be willing to evolve with that as we're going. I want to transition to something I thought about today, only as a controversial topic. So I'm obviously not asking for your political opinion or any kind of like polarization like that. But obviously, with the assassination attempt on Trump, with the election year coming up, a lot of diverse of opinions in politics. I had a former student message me this morning on the first day of school. He had me last year in AP. He told me, "I wish you or somebody could start a club in our school where after school we could talk about real issues. We could talk
Mhm.
about why are we so divided." So it just shows you that I really do think our students are starving for that. I think
Yeah.
people, I think, wrongfully criticize this generation as like spoiled, and you teach this generation, and I do. I don't think that we give this generation enough credit sometimes. I just think that we believe sometimes they need to learn the way we did, and maybe that's not the case. But that being said, I had a professor, I had an American politics professor. His name was Dr. Bennett. I can't remember his first name for right now, but right before his retirement, he said something interesting to me. Students will ask me sometimes, I don't know if they ask you, what do you think of Donald Trump? What do you think of Biden, or whatever presidential candidate had been, whether it was Obama or somebody? Obviously, I have to be very careful with how I answer that particular question, in a public school or any kind of school, to be honest with you. But I've been giving students advice for years, and I want you to tell me whether or not you think I'm steering them the wrong direction. So my American politics professor in my last year of college in my undergrad, he told me, no, I'm sorry, it was an American presidency. That was the class. And I had asked them, like, how do we effectively gauge and measure like presidents in the past? He told me we should never evaluate a presidency until it's been at least 60 years after their presidency. And I thought that was a really interesting answer. And I saw your face there. I was like, I don't know if you find that amusing, if you find that's interesting, or if you might agree with that. So what do you think of that particular logic? Because that's what I've been telling students. I,
Mhm.
I don't just avoid the question and whatnot. I avoid like the bias, but I basically say we have to be careful. Do you feel like you understand like what that professor means by that, and what do you think about that advice?
To an extent, and I can relate to it. On a lighter note, I do teach a baseball history class,
Oh, great.
and I don't spend as much time on the modern era, like the last 15 years, which of course is the era that students are most interested in who take the class because it's their era. It's the stuff that they
Yeah.
actually know. But yet I kind of use that same philosophy in that regard. I was like, well, it's kind of hard to measure the where a baseball player will stand, while he's still
Hmm.
playing. There are some rare exceptions
Hmm.
to that. Yet at the same time, I think something like the presidency is something that's so fundamental to our being and our conception of government that it begs conversation. And I think perhaps the best way to do that when you're talking about somebody like Joe Biden or Donald Trump uh, is the power of parallels. What makes them unique? What makes them different? What makes them stand out? How do they compare and contrast with the predecessors? How are they trying
Hmm.
to defy or replicate the doings of people who previously held the office? And I think that's a very safe and historical way to go about that subject matter.
Hmm.
And on the point of contemporary events, I can recall a teacher who I had in seventh grade who had a modern events elective that students could take, where we did the very thing that you were just talking about. And once a week, students had to bring in a newspaper clipping about something that was happening, and they had to give like a 2-minute spiel summarizing what this article was saying and why that student picked it and why they thought it was important. And then the teacher would facilitate a classroom conversation. I think that too is a really great way
Mhm.
for teachers today to delve into contemporary events. You know, say like, okay, I want you to go to one of these three websites, like Associated Press or Reuters or PBS, something
Mhm.
that's not going to be hyper partisan and
Yeah.
will have a chance to be straight laced objective journalism. Say, I want you to pick an article on a weekly basis from one of these three websites. And every Tuesday, I want you to bring it in, be prepared to discuss it, and then we're going to open up the floor to conversation. So that gives an
Mhm.
opportunity for students to express themselves, which I think is increasingly important because, as I have seen, students have become less and less comfortable in talking in front of people and being able to make an argument or express an opinion. Um, and it also keeps them somewhat informed. So there's
Mhm.
a possible idea for you.
I like that because I've been wondering for years, how can I incentivize students to want to go look at the news? I've had private conversations with some of them over the last couple of years. I feel like my students either don't look at the news at all, or they mainly get their news from TikToks. But
Yeah.
like, there are valuable, like I've seen some TikTok people that try to give like these like news clips, and I try to steer them away from, like as you said, like the partisan, more mainstream ones. And that was going to be one of the questions I was going to ask you was is how in the world as a teacher do I steer these students towards sources in the news that are trustworthy when it feels like almost everything is brought into question. And even one of the first debates we do in class at the very beginning of the year, we're going to do it next Friday. I always ask the students, what is truth? Before we get anything, we'll break down the metaphysics about what
Mm,
that actually means. Because I mean, if you think about it, we have to think about that every time we look at any kind of source throughout the whole year. But I want them to look at their current lives like that, and I like that. You know, we have this intervention period every day for about 35 minutes. That I think that would also be great for too, because teachers are so worried about pacing guides. If I can't weave that into my pacing, maybe that would be a great idea for that, because I do want to get them more into looking at the news going on now, because what they seem to only see is just the bad news. They see only the bad news going on, and then they become very nihilistic about the world that we're in. They
mhm.
feel like, is it really as bad as our grandparents are saying that it is? Like it's going to a hell in a handbasket, and I don't think it's necessarily true, but I do think it focuses on that. Um, I don't want to, like I said, I don't want to keep you too much over the time on there too. I do want to transition to one more question for you, just because it's my own personal fascination, and people that might recognize your voice and your face might probably be from the channel. So I can't remember when you started it, but you had started the YouTube channel Real History. I thought you had started this channel relatively late. Didn't you start this relatively later in YouTube's popularity? Because I didn't know how many years you've been doing it. How many years have you been doing it now?
It's been about 3.5 years now.
Okay. Yeah. And that's one of the things I was going to ask you is that, to me, YouTube is it's a very oversaturated like arena, like for that kind of stuff. But I feel like you have been and you still are becoming like very successful in that. And I guess I wanted to ask you like two questions again. One is that what inspired you to really to go from being what you've been doing, writing and being a professor and getting your doctorate, out of all that business that you've been doing in your family and everything like that, what all of a sudden clicked and said, I'm going to do this YouTube channel, like I'm going to use film on that. So what did that, and it being only three and a half years ago, was that kind of daunting? Because the internet's so oversaturated on YouTube. Were you a little intimidated at all when you first did that? So I know that's a little bit of a compound questioning there for you, but I'm just curious of your thoughts on your channel before we move to the last segment.
Yeah, I did not have high optimism in our channel when it got started. And in fact, it wasn't even my idea. It was a friend's idea, my producer, Andy Collins.
Mhm.
And I've been friends with him and his wife for many, many years. And it often culminated in movie nights at their houses, which inevitably were history movies because we were all history buffs. And inevitably, I would give color commentary as we were watching a movie and be like, well, that's a bunch of nonsense.
It's
Or
like
like,
a
"Oh, let me
Mystery
tell you what
Theater.
really happened."
Yeah. Do you remember
And
Mystery Theater 3000? It's like that thing. You
yes,
just like
yes,
commenting the whole time.
uh-huh, and, Andy just eventually said, "We should put a camera in front of you and just offer, like, real-time reactions, with historical commentary." And I thought, "Nah, I think I was gonna watch that." And then the pandemic happened, and nobody was doing anything or traveling,
Mhm.
and there were no events, there were no parties, there was no getting together, there was nothing like that. And he said, "Hey, like, we're all at home, we're all stuck here, we're all going stir crazy. Let's give this channel thing a try." And I said, "Okay, let's go for it." And so it was a very slow rollout for our channel. I mean, I
Mhm.
think like 2 months passed between the filming of our first episode and it getting edited in its early
Oh,
primitive
yeah.
form, and we've become a lot more polished in the years since.
Mhm.
Um, but what really allowed the channel to take off, and it's still some of our quickest viewed and highest viewed new content that's ever been released, is when we started breaking down Band of Brothers.
Mhm.
And it was like a flat line and then whoop, and and
Yeah.
it was almost inexplicable how quickly the channel grew, thanks to Band of Brothers. But
Yeah.
uh, we're slugging on. It's been a roller coaster of viewership. It's been
Mhm.
a story of ups and downs, and that's the true of any
Yeah.
history themed channel on YouTube. I hear it all the time. But we're keeping at it.
Mhm.
We have a few more episodes coming out until we're going to be doing a major rebrand for our channel.
Hmm.
And so I'll give you a loyal viewer
Yeah, yeah. I
a,
feel
a,
honored.
a heads up and
Yeah.
a brief glimpse. But we're going to be having a new set, quite possibly new opening titles, possibly a new logo.
Oh, so no more couch with the painting in the background? No more
There will be no more couch.
no more couch, yeah.
Even though people become accustomed to that,
Yeah,
and
yeah, it's like,
people like know my living room. When people come to my
yeah.
house, they're saying,
Oh,
"Oh,
so
it's
that
the
is that's your
couch."
personal there it is.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
the
and
famous
so that
couch.
that's been somewhat strange when people come visit me,
Yeah.
like, "Oh, I've seen this couch." But yeah, we're gonna have a brand new set. It's gonna be very scholarly looking. Maybe very
Great.
elegant, very tasteful, very professorial. So stay tuned for that in the coming weeks and months.
Well, congratulations. I'm really happy. I'm very lucky to know that little sneak peek in there too. So yeah, I appreciate the background on that. Like I said, I didn't want the whole episode to just be focused on that. By the way, I owe you an apology and Andy one too, because I've seen episodes with Andy on there with you. So I really do appreciate what you and Andy Collins have both done. Like you guys have done an amazing job. Like I said, thank you for like making history more interesting for people like me, not just other teachers, but like for kids and stuff. And like I said, I was one of those Band of Brothers people that when I first came across your channel because of that, and I've actually not to be like embarrassing for you or anything like that, but in my class, whenever I've covered the end of the Holocaust and the liberation of the camps, I've actually shown some of your commentary about that
Mm,
episode, the Why We Fight episode, and
wow,
just some of what you've said, because it's not just seeing it, because I let them see it with no commentary, but then I can also show them that same breakdown of the scene and
wow.
then how you feel, because again, so I appreciate everything that you've done, and I can't imagine like if we go back to 3 years ago, what would Jared say back then? No, what would you think? Would you? I don't know if you would have thought that the channel would have become what it's become or monetized and all those other kind of things. So it's really incredible that you and Andy have done that really well. That's what I'm saying too. For like anybody that really wanted to start a noble podcast or a podcast or a YouTube channel like you have done in the past, it's never really too late to do that. Like you took the COVID situation and kind of took it to your advantage and made the most of it. So I appreciate it. I hope you don't decide to stop it anytime soon, but I know obviously things in life come up. So hey, as long as you're still putting videos out, I'm going to be watching
Thank
for
you.
sure. So I
I
appreciate
really
that.
appreciate
So
you use it in the
um,
classroom.
hey, you're welcome. And so hey, here's the last topic that I wanted to hit on. Obviously, just to preface this, whenever I was growing up, and going through undergrad to be teaching, one of the main criticisms about using movies in classes. I don't know if you had teachers like this, but I did particularly have one teacher that was like that stereotypical coach where it's like, hey, I'm going to put this movie on, turn the lights off, and then I'm going to work on my film, like my football film. And I always thought that was like in movies and TV shows, like the Wonder Years. That's just a thing. There's not really teachers that are like that. But I do want to give credit. Not all coach teachers are like that. I have a lot of coach teachers that are very good classroom teachers. But I do know there's a negative stigma in high school and in middle school about using movies to supplement in class. Because I think the stigma is, oh, you're just using it to fill your gap. You're not very good at teaching. You're not engaging them. You're not really doing anything interactive. And I've seen you to kind of preach about this or have rationales on why you think it's important. Is there a way that you might be able to sum up to our viewers and listeners, especially ones that are teachers and heck, students too, that why do you think as a professor, you use movies and clips in class? Why do you think it's still effective and there's merit to us using movies in class more or still?
Yeah. And there's a lot of different ways to answer your question, because when you say I show movies in the classroom, I can ask, well, what types of movies? Are you showing motion pictures in their entirety? Are you showing 10 minutes of a movie? Are you showing a documentary? Are you showing clips of a documentary? Are you showing something homemade on YouTube? And so I think there's a lot of caveats to using film, quote unquote, in the classroom. I would say, regardless of what you show or how much of it you show, it can't merely be complacent viewing. It has to be film with context. It has to be film with engagement. And so what I do at the college level is that usually if we watch, let's say, a 50-minute documentary and we spend a whole class period watching it, I will hand out a 10-question worksheet to go along with it. And so the students can't merely put down their heads and nap as it's being shown. They have to stay attentive, and they have to watch for key moments to answer pertinent questions. So I think that is one way of doing it. And then you can open up the floor to conversation as you are discussing the answers to those questions. I've also, in more recent years, and this may be helpful for educators who are looking for alternative assignments in this era of artificial intelligence where the traditional book report or biography just doesn't fly anymore. I have students pick a historical book, and it can be fiction or nonfiction, and I have them take a chapter of it and adapt it into a movie screenplay.
Really? Interesting.
AI can't do that yet. AI can't write movie scripts. It can't format them. It can't speak in first person. It can't give that sort of personalization. It may at some point. It can't yet. And so that is a really effective way to get students to read at least a portion of a book. And you can tie it back to the usefulness of movies conversation, because it triggers not only research, but there's a creative element to it as well. And it defies the capabilities of artificial intelligence of where we stand at this current moment. So more and more so, I've been doing things like that. So to circle back to the beginning of our conversation, it all comes down to engagement and personalization.
And that was another common theme I've heard from you tonight, is that when it comes to the teaching part, is the communication part from students too. It's not just doing like a worksheet, but what else are you doing with that? Because you had said earlier in the podcast that it's important that we give students a voice, right? That they know how to use their voice. I do a lot of what's called Socratic seminars in class where we use those things. So we're constantly working on how to deal with conflict, how to deal with argumentation in a respectful way, like being very meticulous about that. I basically am one of those teachers. I even wear a t-shirt that says why on it, because I'm just constantly asking them why. Because as you know, like especially high school students, they want to give you the most short answer possible most of the time. And they're not used to be going, well, why do you feel that way? And constantly. So I tell them, you're kind of like the annoying little 4-year-old asking you why over and over again. I like what you said too, that you can find unique ways around AI, and I know AI is a hotly contested topic right now in education. As somebody like me that definitely we write essays in class and AP, I have to deal with plagiarism and things like that, and students using it. So I'm trying to find ways of working around that, or at least utilizing it as a creative tool that might enhance. So I appreciate it again, because again, that engagement is so key. It's probably one of those main themes I'm going to take from the episode tonight, and I hope our listeners do as well for that. Now again, you basically answered the majority of my questions that were on there. The only other follow-up question I want to ask you about movies is the feedback part, because I'm always curious of how students feel. So methods like the movie script method, you've already got to try that out. But even like you've had YouTube videos before where you've told your audience that I might show this kind of clip and then start talking to students about how they feel about that, trying to pull the layers out of it. What sort of feedback do you usually get on average from students about the way that you use film in class, the way you use clips? I suppose you use clips for the most part, right? Is that
Mhm.
because time being it? And that's what I try to do. So do students by majority like that? Do they don't like it? Do they find it redundant? What have you received as a teacher from that?
Luckily for me, at the collegiate level, we have end of semester surveys that students complete anonymously. And so they can be completely honest and
Hmm.
transparent about how they feel with absolutely no risk of repercussion.
Yeah.
And while that may be frightening to some teachers, it is incredibly beneficial because it really gives a lot of good perspective on what we do well and what we can do better. And consistently, students herald the idea of using film clips is something that is inherently beneficial to their ability to understand and retain some of the bigger concepts that I'm trying to impart to them.
Hmm.
This is especially so in what might be considered niche classes. I teach a Pennsylvania history course, and I have a vast documentary library that I incorporate every day
Hmm.
in that course. And students are frankly surprised by the level of visual content that I can show them. And so increasingly, and this is a recent poll result that came out just a few weeks ago, increasingly, Americans are gaining their educational content not from books, but documentaries. Documentaries
Good.
rank as one of the most trusted forms of medium for learning that's out there. And so, in the era of streaming, and indeed, Netflix has a lot of really great documentaries that
Yeah, you're
are
right.
available to viewers. Uh, People can watch or listen to those anywhere they go. It doesn't require the sort of focus and concentration that reading does. And even
Mhm.
though I love my bookcase here in the
Yeah.
background, and I love showing it off when I do interviews,
Yeah.
um, not everybody learns that way.
Mhm.
And we have to accept that fact as the tides are shifting.
Oh yeah, you're right. I mean, you've seen podcasts increase in popularity, audiobooks are in more popularity. And again, most of our students they don't have cable. They stream. Like most of the
Mhm.
families stream through everything. So you have a great point about using those mediums to take for our advantage, right? If we know it has a really good documentary, we should be recommending that World War II documentary last year. I don't know if you saw the what was it World War is it World War II from the front lines? I think that's
Mm,
what it was called,
yeah,
but it had some excellent sources from like the Polish Rebellion. And I actually
yeah.
recommended many of my students, especially my AP students, to go watch that, and some actually did. Sorry,
Yeah,
I interrupted you there.
I was just about to say the exact same thing that you did. I always find it really rewarding when after I show something and students raise their hand and they say, "What was the name of that again?" Because I know that they wanna go and
Yeah.
watch it for themselves. And so just like little Jared in kindergarten, it's all about whetting the appetite a little bit. And if you can do that just ever so slightly,
Mhm.
you don't know where it might lead.
Yeah, you're right, and that's what I'm trying to do as a teacher is just try to get some of their appetites whet from like just getting interested. And I will try to tell them in certain movie clips, this movie is not very historically or accurate. It has trouble, but it doesn't mean that because of that clip, it doesn't cause that kid to spark interest in ancient Greece or something like that. If it sends them down that interest trail, then I think that's part of our job, right? Like we're encouraging that. But hey, I'm sorry to go over time a little bit
Oh,
there,
that's
Jared.
quite all right.
I just have
I'll add one more thing on that
go ahead,
point.
go ahead.
That movies are also primary sources, because something that I say a lot on the channel is that all movies that are made ever, they're snapshots of the time in which they are made, and sometimes they can
Yeah,
tell us as much,
I had a feeling that's what you're going to say. Yeah,
yeah,
good
about the
point.
time in which they are made as the time that they represent. And so, if you look at the movie 300, all right, what does that say about, notions of manhood,
Yeah,
and what does it mean to be a man in the early
yeah.
2000s? Uh, it tells us a lot more about manhood in
Mhm.
the early 21st century than what it does in the times of ancient Persia or anything like that. So,
Yeah, that's a great point. And again, it's something I need to remember to ask as a teacher more often too. Is whenever we do these kind of clips, I need to show them, just like I do with any source, like when was that movie made? Now think about what was going on, like what's America like, what's the world like when that's going on. And again, Jared, I'm not going to put you on a spot to say how old you are because I don't think you've ever said that before on anything. But I think I'm older than you. I'm not 100% sure, but I know that me and you remember the '90s pretty well. I think, and but I wanted to tell you that to me, it makes me think of, I think me and you were very lucky. I think that we grew up in an era where I feel like a lot of history movies were very popular. Not that all of them were necessarily good, but now in the last 15 to 20 years, I'm like, you don't see it as often, right? I feel like you're showing previews of upcoming history movies less than maybe you would have done earlier on. And I wonder what that says about us, And I know it was coming up on an anniversary, but like, why was Saving Private Ryan made when it was? Why then? And without that movie, as I'm sure that you would probably agree on, does Band of Brothers ever even get made without that? I mean, especially with Spielberg and Hanks and all them working on that. It fascinates me because I feel like you and I were lucky enough to be young through that era. And I still consider Gettysburg one of those ones. I know it's a TV movie, but I still remember being a kid, like sitting on the floor watching it with my dad. And I remember, I think it was on TNT on like
right,
a 3-night thing. And I remember my family made a huge deal about it. It was like when Roots came out. Like people made a
right,
huge deal about that. And we like blocked off time as a family. Because
yeah,
whenever you and I were kids, you had TGIF. Like on Fridays, everybody would watch the same shows.
yeah,
And I know it's different in our era now with streaming,
yeah.
but
Everything's
all
siloed now.
yeah. But sometimes you can find some like gems though. I think it was a year or two ago you recommended. I can't. You have to tell me the movie name again, but it was that movie on Netflix. I think it was about like some Canadian soldiers that were gliding in, and
The
remember they got
Forgotten
like
Battle.
stranded. Yes. Okay,
Yeah,
so I probably wouldn't have watched that movie if I didn't watch your video on that first. And I was like, oh, I didn't even know Netflix had this.
yeah,
But there's another great one from a point of view, and you brought it up a good point. Canada's often forgotten. Like
yeah,
people forget how involved they were on D-Day and other things.
yeah.
So yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I was going
Well,
on
you
a
can
little
tell
rant.
movie companies that when we try to use 5 seconds of their film so they don't jump on us, that we're
Yeah.
actually really good promotion for your movies. We
Mhm.
aren't pirates.
Yeah.
So, uh,
Yeah.
I
Exactly
I
like
I
that.
wish more people would voice what you just said.
Yeah, I don't know. I said I've been feeling like that for a while. I've talked to my friends and that, but that's why I think that a lot of your advice and your shows, it's resonated me really with me, not just as someone who likes history, but as a teacher on that. Jared, if you're okay, could I ask you just one more question tonight?
Sure.
It doesn't have to be a long one because I don't want to keep you too long. But and I'm not putting you on a spot here because I'm not trying to make you sound like you're being negative to high school teachers, especially public school. But often we're trying to tell students about what college is going to be like and getting them ready for that. But I've always wanted to ask a history professor, what could we do more? So teachers like me that are teaching high school students, getting them ready for college. Is there something that you wish you could say to us? Not that you're trying to do our job for us, but is there any advice that you could give us, or things that you and other professors maybe wish that maybe we would do more? I think that would be a great place to end the podcast. Is
Yeah.
what do you feel like we could do better to get students more ready for college in
Uh,
history? In history.
keep having them write.
Okay.
The old saying goes, practice makes perfect. And over the last few years in particular, particularly in the wake of the pandemic, when so many students didn't get the sort of learning environment and development that they
Mhm.
deserved due to online learning, uh, it, that has corresponded with a sharp decline in the quality of writing. And
Mhm.
so I know it's a time-consuming process, especially when you teach 6 classes a day, 5
Mhm.
days a
Yeah.
week. God bless you
Yeah.
all who do
Yeah. It's
that.
a yeah,
I'm so
especially if you have
spoiled.
multiple preps. I'm lucky enough to have two, but I have teachers that have 4 or 5 preps. Like, I don't know
Yeah,
how you do it.
yeah. But giving them the sort of consistent writing exercises, and even if it's in
Mhm.
class, so they can't use AI. More and
Yep.
more, I'm having
Exactly.
students write things on paper because it's really the only
Yes.
way
Yeah.
to
I'm going
safeguard it.
to the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's funny how technology is supposed to be making our lives easier, but we're in some ways going backwards, and we're
Yeah.
going back to loose leaf and pencils.
Yeah. And
But
it's odd, because like you said earlier, students seem somewhat a little bit more isolated today. But if you think about it, we have more access to each other in communication we ever have in human history.
yeah,
But in some ways, our argumentation and our being able to speak up for our younger generation, it's not really correlating really well. So maybe it's the way we're using it. I want to ask you a follow up on that. I think whenever we hear from you all that we need to write more, I think many of us we panic and think, oh, you mean essays or like big long papers. And I want, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Jared, but I feel like writing doesn't necessarily have to always be that long either. Like it could be a paragraph, like an exit slip a day or something like that. And that's something I'm going to do a lot
a
more often this
diary
year.
entry.
Yeah, yeah, very good. Like having academic diaries. But
Yeah,
another thing, I don't know, this is the time constraint thing, right? I feel like another problem that kids have told me before is they said they've done that in classes, but they don't really get any feedback on it. And that's something
mhm,
that I try really hard to say, look, I've marked on your paragraph. I've given you advice on the side, what you've done well at, what you need to work on. And I think students learn to appreciate that when they see that. So I don't know if you would agree on this, but I don't think it's just only writing, but it's also giving dynamic feedback so
yeah,
that they know, because some students think that we just give busy work to give it. And
right,
I think the longer you do that, the more disingenuous it feels. And the students just stop trying, or they hire someone to do the paper for them or the
mhm,
essay, which, as you know, there's all kinds of outlets for that, especially in college on that. So you got to fight that sometimes too. But I appreciate that. I agree with you. I think that we do need to do writing more. Do you think some of that is from standardized testing? So our state standardized testing, as you know, is predominantly multiple choice. And I think sometimes we worry so much about we have to get ready for this, whatever state test it is, it's only multiple choice. So we're just going to
yeah,
make all of our tests and assessments that. Do you think in some ways summative assessments have hurt writing? Not all of them.
absolutely,
I know in AP they don't, but like
yeah.
state summative assessments, you think they have?
Yeah, and
Why is
I'll put
that?
a disclaimer before this and say that this is solely my opinion and not yours or that of my
It's
employer.
okay. I'm tenured
Um,
too, so I'm okay.
I
So
think standardized tests are one of the great evils of the education system
yeah,
in the United States,
we all want
uh,
to hear that. I think
because,
everybody does.
what it is, it's a money-making scheme
Mhm.
setting false measures of success. And, I feel that I can relate to that personally. I never did well on standardized
Mhm.
tests. I've always ranked in like the bottom 20th percentile on my math tests. Yet I was always an A and B student in traditional school. It's not an
Mhm.
effective way to measure a student's intellect or potential. And additionally, so much time is spent on preparing for the test because we
Mhm.
want to boost a school district's standing or
Yeah, the
percentages.
school report cards. Yep, all
Yeah,
that.
and in turn, what that means is that students aren't getting the art and music and social studies
Mhm.
and home ec classes that were part of an interdisciplinary education in decades past.
Mhm.
And in turn, what that means is that our schools once helped to create citizens. Now they create consumers and employees. And I think that it is no coincidence that the decline of humanities, both in public education and higher education, also coincides with our decline as a democracy in many regards. And
Good
so
point.
all of this is connected. And I think so much of it is rooted in the problems and the shortcomings of standardized tests. So there aren't many people that would say that probably, but
I'm
that's
really
that's
happy
my
you would
thought.
say it. You know, I wish, and like I said, not to give you any grief or anything like that, but I wish I could just clip the whole last part you said and share that out. I think it would go
Go for it.
viral with public school teachers. So I appreciate that. And you know what, it makes me wonder if that is one of the many reasons, or maybe one of the main reasons why we are seeing a decline in public education, or at least a decline in the value for public education. And we've seen a rise of charter schools and private schools and different items like this. I don't know. Like I said, it's tough because I have administrators and teachers that we try really hard to make it individualized and unique. But on my criticism is more like on like a higher level. You know what I mean? Like the decision makers, like your state members, your federal ones. I don't think they have the right intentions out for our youth. Like
Hmm.
again, the ACT is supposed to be a predictor of how you're
Yeah.
being in college. I mean, how many students score low on ACT and actually do well in college? Like, and
Yeah.
maybe, and that's another reason why we're seeing a decline of ACT and in some measurements as well too. But yeah, thank you, Dr. Frederick, for saying that. I really appreciate that. So many teachers will hear that student and be like, "That's exactly how we feel." In that one. But so I'll go ahead and wrap the show up. Jared, I really appreciated you taking an hour out of your time to do this. Do you have any lasting things that you want to say to the audience before we close this up?
As always, my hats off to you and any educators out there. I know it's not an easy time to be an educator, especially in the public arena. There are a lot of landmines and high wires to balance yourself on. But I earnestly say this: you are needed, and even though it may not always seem like it, you are appreciated. And so my parting words here are, continue to help us make citizens.
Fight the good fight, right? Do the best as we can. So hey, I appreciate that advice. And I tell you what, your timing couldn't be better. Maybe it was meant to be that we had the podcast today, because I don't know if you knew this or not, but most schools, at least in Kentucky, started this week. Like we started either yesterday or today. So your parting words, I think, is something that me and a lot of teachers we need to hear. Like as tough as it is, we need that encouragement, because, like I said, it is tough within the environment that we're in. So thank you again, Jared, for your time. Thank you for any listeners that have taken time out of your day to listen to this episode. I hope, as usual, you find value in it. And other than that, have a great week and be contagious.